National Security and the Subcommittee on Government Operations will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. The United States faces clear and present dangers from Islamic jihadists both at home and abroad. From the attacks in Paris to the massacre in San Bernardino, it is clear that militant Islamists are on the march. Identifying terrorists and stopping them before they can strike must be a priority for the United States and its allies. Certainly, the federal government has a duty to prevent terrorists and those sympathetic to their aims from entering the United States, a duty that it is not currently satisfying. Almost 12 years ago, the bipartisan 9/11 Commission provided a roadmap for the government to follow in fulfilling these crucial responsibilities. It stated, quote, "Targeting travel is at least as powerful a weapon against terrorists as targeting their money. The United States should combine terrorist travel intelligence operations and law enforcement in a strategy to intercept terrorists, find terrorist travel facilitators, and constrain terrorist mobility," end quote. Our consular officers abroad and the inspectors at our ports of entry are on the first line of defense in this strategy. Most foreign nationals who seek to enter the United States must apply to the State Department and meet with one of those consular officers to obtain a visa. Those officers are trained to separate bona fide travelers from those with malevolent intentions. Yet, as we have seen with the visa issued to San Bernardino terrorist Tashfeen Malik, these officers have not always been successful at weeding out militant Islamists. An exception to the rule that an individual who seeks entry to the United States must apply for and receive a visa before entering this country is the Visa Waiver Program. The Visa Waiver Program allows foreign nationals of 38 countries, mostly in Europe, to enter the United States as non-immigrant visas for up to 90 days without having to obtain a visa or undergo an in-person interview at a U.S. consulate. Approximately 20 million foreign nationals enter each year under the program, constituting 37% of all visitors from overseas. And as this committee has shown in testimony, many have overstayed that 90 days without consequence. The November 13, 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris made clear that there were vulnerabilities in the Visa Waiver Program. The terrorists in that massacre killed 130 people and caused over 350 injuries, and at least 5 of the attackers were French national, 2 of whom were living in Belgium, and 1 was a Belgian national. And nationals of both France and Belgium are able to enter the United States under the Visa Waiver Program. Accordingly, at least 6 of the Paris attackers could have attempted to enter this country under the Visa Waiver Program. All that they would have needed was a plane ticket. Those attacks highlight the fact that even within the borders of our closest international partners, there are insular communities sheltering militant Islamists bent on destroying our way of life. Many Islamic jihadists in places such as Syria are Western passport holders or dual nationals who could take advantage of the Visa Waiver Program. This exposes the American people to the possibility that these militants, after being trained and further radicalized in Syria and Iraq, could exploit the Visa Waiver Program to enter this country. These concerns and others were understood by this committee in 2 hearings that we held in early December. In the first, we identified flaws in the Visa Waiver Program that could be exploited by terrorists and criminals. In the second hearing, which followed from the findings of the first, the full committee looked at potential defects in our nation's terrorist screening scheme as a whole. In response to these concerns and others, Congress crafted a bipartisan measure that included several changes to the Visa Waiver Program intended to prevent terrorists from exploiting the program and to address other national security concerns, and those changes took effect, were signed into law in December. The bill responded to concerns that were raised about the risks related to visa fee travel by foreign nationals who carry both passports of visa waiver countries and of other countries that are not friendly to the United States, as well as individuals who have traveled to countries of concern and state sponsors of terrorism, including Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Sudan. It did not prevent those individuals from entering our country, but it did require them to obtain a visa before coming to the United States. Gave the Secretary of State the authority to designate additional countries of concern. And finally, the bill gave the Secretary of Homeland Security very limited authority to waive these provisions for specific and targeted national security or law enforcement purposes. As it has done in the past, however, this administration refused to abide by the limits placed on it by Congress. After these changes were signed into law, the Iranian government objected that the restrictions would violate the nuclear agreement, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was adopted in October of 2015. The Iranians claim that the joint JCPOA obliges the United States not to take any actions that will, quote, adversely affect the normalization of trade and economic relations with Iran, end quote. In response, the administration moved to placate Iran. In a letter to the Iranian foreign minister dated one day after the president signed the visa waiver bill into law, the Secretary of State made clear that the administration would find ways to ensure that changes to visa waiver program would not interfere with Iran's, quote, legitimate business interests. Subsequently, on January 21, 2016, the administration announced that it would use what was intended to be a limited law enforcement exception to allow foreign nationals who have traveled to Iran, Iraq, Sudan, and Syria as journalists, aid workers, military or government workers, or for unspecified legitimate business-related purposes to be issued waivers to the restrictions contained in the bill. Travel for purported legitimate business-related purpose was exactly the type of travel that Congress sought to restrict. In the real world, espionage is likely to involve transfer of restricted goods and technology by intermediaries who are putatively citizens of friendly or neutral nations, so it is to be carried out in secret by foreign intelligence officers. I'm concerned about these actions both as Chairman of the National Security Subcommittee and as a member of the House Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte told the House Judiciary Committee that the administration's decision to abuse their limited waiver authority and allow scores of people who have traveled to or are dual nationals of countries like Iraq and Syria flies in the face of the reason and congressional intent. The Obama administration, he says, is essentially rewriting the law by blowing wide open a small window of discretion that Congress gave it for law enforcement and national security reasons. In fact, the categories of people that the Obama administration exempting from the law were expressly rejected by Congress, end quote. This administration takes these actions in clear violation of the law and does so to favor a known state sponsor of terrorism. And I would add, businesses in Iran, many of them are controlled by the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a designated terrorist organization. So I thank our witnesses for their testimony today, and I look forward to examining issues related to the impact of this executive action on the visa waiver program. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security, Mr. Lynch, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and also Chairman Meadows for their good work, and Ranking Member Connolly for holding this hearing to examine the implementation of the visa waiver program. I'd also like to thank in advance our witnesses today for your willingness to help the committee with its work. In December of 2015, Congress enacted and President Obama signed the Visa Waiver Program Improvement and Terrorist Travel Prevention Act as part of the recent Omnibus Appropriation Bill. This bipartisan legislation to strengthen the visa waiver program became law in the wake of the devastating terrorist attacks in Paris, France in November of 2015, perpetrated by several attackers who were citizens of so-called visa waiver program countries, including France and Belgium. It also followed the tragic mass shootings in San Bernardino, California in December of 2015 that also evidenced the real and continued threat of a terrorist attack committed in U.S. soil. The new act, which I voted for, generally provides that even if you are a citizen of one of the 38 allied nations that participate in the visa waiver program, you are no longer eligible for temporary visa-free entry to the United States if you travel to Syria, Iraq, Sudan, or Iran since March 1, 2011. Similarly, dual nationals of any of these four countries are prohibited from visa waiver program eligibility. The Act also recognizes that in select cases, the application of these new program restrictions could potentially run contrary to national security interests by, for example, excluding UN personnel, inspectors with the IAEA, or humanitarian relief workers who have visited one of these countries of concern from the visa waiver program. In order to better ensure that such individuals are able to do their jobs, the Act provides that the Secretary of Homeland Security may in some instances grant a waiver to a foreign national, quote, if the Secretary determines that such a waiver is consistent with the law enforcement or national security interests of the United States. It also requires the Secretary to submit to Congress an annual report on each instance in which the Secretary exercises that waiver authority. Last month, the Department of Homeland Security explained the limited circumstances under which the Secretary may consider granting a national security waiver. In particular, the agency underscored that such waivers, quote, will be granted only on a case-by-case basis, close quote. The Department also noted that waiver eligibility travelers may include representatives of international and humanitarian organizations, as well as journalists who travel to Iran, Iraq, Sudan, or Syria in performance of their job duties. They may also include individuals who travel to Iraq and Iran for legitimate business-related purposes. I strongly agree that we must conduct meaningful oversight of the implementation of this National Security Waiver Authority. However, in analyzing the effectiveness of this provision, we must be mindful that our shared interest in national security does not exclude the goals of promoting humanitarian assistance, accountability, and economic stability in the 4 countries of concern. Quite the contrary, they can go hand in hand. Last month, Chairman Chaffetz authorized Representative Steve Russell and myself to lead an oversight delegation to Zatari refugee camp on the Jordanian-Syrian border and the Onjupanar refugee camp in Kilis province on the Turkish-Syrian border. We met with representatives from several international and humanitarian organizations, including the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, the World Food Program, and Save the Children, and local humanitarian relief healthcare groups. These officials repeatedly noted that humanitarian aid does not only provide a dignified living for people in need, but also makes us all safer by de-incentivizing desperate populations from making desperate choices. This humanitarian aid keeps refugees near their home country, albeit on the other side of the border. Similarly, conflict reporting by journalists in places like Aleppo, Syria, has proven critical to informing U.S. officials and the American public about the security and humanitarian facts on the ground. As noted by Professor Ellen Shearer, co-director of the National Security Journalism Initiative at Northwestern University, quote, the cost of getting the truth could be high, but the cost of not getting the full story is very real too, close quote. In Iraq, U.S. led efforts to combat the Islamic State will only be complicated if the country cannot conduct legitimate business and dive deeper into the economic crisis and the social unrest caused by falling oil prices. And in Iran, international efforts to ensure compliance with the robust nuclear inspection regime set forth in the Iran nuclear agreement would be undermined if an Iranian economy that is unable to refurbish a deteriorating domestic plane fleet used by IAEA inspectors, that's International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, to travel between inspection sites. And a number of those inspectors have indicated that that's probably the most dangerous thing they do in Iran is fly from city to city on Iran Air because of the terrible condition of their air fleet. So we have to consider that. Again, now, I voted for tighter restrictions in the visa waiver program, given the evidence that the Islamic State has adopted a tactic of feeding militant extremists into the stream of legitimate refugees and the wider diaspora created by the wars in Iraq and Syria. I do believe, though, that in affording the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security flexibility that he has been granted by statute, it should be prudently and rarely exercised. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to further discussing these and other issues relating to the visa waiver program with today's witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time. And thank you for your indulgence.
Thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Government Operations, Mr. Meadows, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Lynch, for your accurate remarks, and certainly look forward to working with both of you on this particular issue. It seems like every time we turn around on the televisions, we see unspeakable atrocities that are being committed by ISIS. You know, it's come now into the bedrooms and homes of many of us where we have to deal with this reality. The increased presence of ISIS in countries like Iraq and Syria highlight the concerns over the reports of thousands of citizens in Western countries traveling to places like Iraq and Syria, and then training with these terrorist groups and then returning home. Even late last year, obviously, the people of Paris saw this practice manifest in a just horrific tragedy. Individuals with dual citizenship travel to Syria and train with these so-called fighters that fight against innocent civilians going about their everyday life, but it's really not a fight. This was an attack against fathers and mothers, daughters and sons. And these monsters who carried out these attacks took advantage of rights granted to them as nationals of France and nationals of Belgium. in an effort to help prevent individuals from similarly exploiting the advantages afforded to them by having a citizenship of those countries covered by the Visa Waiver Program. Congress, as Mr. Lynch put forth, passed a piece of legislation late last year that would require those individuals who travel to certain countries of concern or who hold dual citizenship with those countries to go through a more rigorous review before being admitted to the United States, a common sense approach. But since the President has signed that bill into law, it seems like the administration is starting to backpedal on some of those changes to expand that narrow exception for national security afforded to them by Congress. The administration's disregard for the congressional intent is intolerable, especially when we look at the action being done to appease a country like Iran. It's troubling. I understand that there are many people affected by Congress's changes to the Visa Waiver Program that mean no harm to the United States. It's very obvious. What is important to understand is that being excluded from the Visa Waiver Program does not keep these people from coming to the United States. It just means that they have to apply for a visa like all other people around the world that are not included in that program. Somehow we think that it's keeping them from coming to the United States. That being said, we need to make sure that our visa screening process is effective, and I've been pressuring DHS for months, including in a hearing in December to report to Congress on the number of individuals who have overstayed their visas. While DHS finally released a report about 3 weeks ago, the report left much to be desired. For instance, the figure included only a couple of subsections of admissions, leaving incomplete the picture of visa overstays. DHS reports that only 1% of admissions overstayed their permissible period. However, when you start to look at this, the administration only counted the travelers each time they entered the country as a unique admission. Now, what I'm saying there is thereby it lowers the overall numbers to suggest that we're doing a better job than we really are. That figure that was reported by DHS suggested that there were some 500,000 foreign travelers who had overstayed their visa and remained in the United States illegally. And as of January 4th, that number had been brought down to 416,000 of these who had not left the country. As I said, this number does not give the full picture either. It does not include those who enter by land or those who have entered for other reasons other than business or pleasure, such as students, guest workers, exchange visitors. In fact, of the over 70 specific types of non-immigrant visas, DHS report only covers 2 out of 70. This report is supposed to inform Congress not only is it missing critical information, but DHS will not even provide Congress with the background memos used to compile the report. We have a DHS official here today, so I hope that hopefully you can answer some of these questions for us and start to illuminate both members of the majority and the minority. I also hope that you can help us understand the significance of a biometric exit system and actually putting that in so that we can start to track this system and have proper reporting for visa overstays, because it is a critical function for our national security. And I can tell you that I imagine everyone in this room agrees with this. I don't want to have an incident that happens here that could have been prevented by implementing the proper procedures to look at this. Far too often we look backwards. We say, well, only if this had happened or only if that had happened. Maybe this disaster could have been prevented. I know one thing for sure. We must get it right. We must get it right away. And I thank the chairman for his patience and his direction and his leadership on this, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Connolly, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Government Operations, for his opening statement.
I thank the chair, and welcome to our panelists. Last fall and last December, in light of the tragedies of San Bernardino and Paris, Congress came together and passed the Visa Waiver Program Improvement in Terrorist Travel Prevention Act of 2015, passed as part of the Omnibus Spending Bill. It will enhance VWP's information sharing requirements to better assess travelers' risk. It also requires covered travelers to use an e-passport containing technology that stores travel information, digital photograph, biographic information, and biometric identifiers. Such passports also included security layers that make it more difficult to alter or duplicate them compared to other forms of travel identification. The bill also tightens eligibility restrictions for VWP participation, but does not block international travel using the normal visa process. It would prohibit participation in that process, the VWP process, by anyone who's traveled to Syria, Iraq, Iran, Sudan, and other designated areas of concern within the past 5 years, and dual nationals of those countries. It also empowers the Department of Homeland Security with the authority to waive these restrictions to support, and I quote, the law enforcement and national security interests of the United States. Department of Homeland Security recently announced that it would implement those waivers on a limited case-by-case basis for certain categories of individuals, including those who travel to Iran or Iraq for legitimate business, professional, and humanitarian purposes. Of course, individuals who may fall into one of those accepted categories are not automatically allowed entry via the program. They must undergo the same rigorous screening process as any other traveler prior to receiving approval to travel under that program. Some of my colleagues, critics of the administration, claim that the Department's implementation is contrary to congressional intent and represents an overreach of executive authority, as the legislative language did not expressly provide for such exceptions. However, I believe the Department is taking a common-sense approach to implementing the waiver authority we granted them, and that it's not inconsistent with the requirements of the law. In fact, some argue that permitting individuals from waiver countries to travel to Iran or Iraq for legitimate business, professional, and humanitarian purposes serves to promote rather than undermine the law enforcement and national security interests of our country. There is concern that this waiver was provided in the interest of preserving the JCPOA in a manner inconsistent with the commitments the U.S. made in the deal. That's the nuclear deal with Iran. For one, the waiver specifies travel after the date the agreement was signed. Additionally, the only reason Iran is subjected to these reforms is its designation as a state sponsor of terror. We were assured that Iran's support for terrorism was firewalled, if one can make a verb out of that, from the JCPOA negotiations, and for good reason, as we do not want to relitigate the nuclear issue every time we take up one of the myriad challenges Iran poses to regional and U.S. security. In providing this waiver, the administration must answer these challenges and make crystal clear to Congress that it was not provided in the interest of addressing perceptions in Tehran. The grounds for this waiver must rest solely on a sincere interest to preserve the integrity of the visa waiver program and its ability to serve as an incentive for implementing border security and surveillance best practices. I certainly look forward, Mr. Chairman, to hearing from our witnesses as to whether they believe that allowing, in limited circumstances, Europeans who travel to Iran for legitimate business to participate in the visa waiver program, and whether that creates a security risk or actually enhances national security. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you. I'll hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. We'll now recognize our panel of witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome the Honorable Gil Kurlikowski, Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Ms. Hillary Bezier Johnson, Deputy Coordinator for Homeland Security Screening and Designations at the Bureau of Counterterrorism at the Department of State. Ms. Johnson is accompanied by Mr. Edward Rumatowski, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Consular Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, whose expertise may be needed during the questioning. Ms. Jessica Vaughn, Director of Policy Studies at the Center for Immigration Studies. Mr. Emmanuel Odulengi, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Mr. Stephen Heifetz, Partner at Steptoe & Johnson, LLP. Welcome all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. We will also swear in Mr. Romatowski. So if you can please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please be seated. All witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. Now, my pleasure, Mr. Kurlikowski, you're up.
Chairman DeSantis, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Lynch, and Ranking Member Connolly, and distinguished members of the subcommittees, I returned on Sunday morning from California, where CBP had an integral role in safeguarding the Super Bowl. I witnessed the aspects of CBP's very broad and complex mission all in one place, providing security, surveillance on the ground, surveillance from the air, screening cargo and deliveries for weapons and dangerous items. Well, Customs and Border Protection has a critical role in securing international travel against the threat of terrorists and their supporters, while facilitating lawful travel and tourism. Every day, we process 1 million travelers. As you know, from boarding a U.S.-bound flight, most foreign nationals must obtain a non-immigrant visa issued by a United States embassy or consulate, or the traveler must apply for a travel authorization through CBP's Electronic System for Travel Authorization, or ESTA. Through ESTA, CBP conducts enhanced vetting of these applicants in order to assess whether they are eligible to travel and whether they pose a potential risk to the United States. Over the past 15 months, CBP has worked with DHS to strengthen the security of the program through enhancements to ESTA in order to identify those who may pose a threat to the United States. We have introduced additional ESTA data fields that have increased the ability of CBP and the National Counterterrorism Center to identify applicants with potential connections to terrorism. In addition to these enhancements, this past August, Secretary Johnson announced further security measures for the Visa Waiver Program countries, including increased traveler data collection, analysis, and reporting. He required the use of Interpol's stolen and lost travel document database and the required use of electronic passports, which contain additional security features. Now, on December 18th, the President signed into law the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2016, which includes the Visa Waiver Program Improvement and Terrorist Travel Prevention Act of 2015. And with some exceptions for official military and government travel, the law prohibits VWP travel for individuals who have been present at any time on or after March 1st, 2011, in Iraq, Syria, or countries designated as state sponsors of terrorism, which includes Iran and Sudan. It also prohibits VWP travel for individuals who are dual nationals of one of these countries and a VWP country. CBP quickly began implementing some of the changes required by the new law. For example, we revoked 17,000 ESTA travel authorizations. We established, in conjunction with our interagency partners, a terrorist travel prevention cell at our National Targeting Center. And the cell will enhance the department's efforts to identify and prevent foreign terrorist fighter travel. And a subset of the cell's mission will be to scrutinize individual waiver requests permitted by the new law. Additionally, CBP will add new fields to the ESTA application by the end of this month that will ask additional questions to further improve our ability to vet individual travelers and make decisions about their eligibility in accordance with the recent changes. Well, as terrorists change their methods and tactics, DHS will continue to work our federal and international partners to counter foreign fighter threats to the homeland. We'll continue to strengthen our travel security programs and systems and enhance our capabilities to secure international air travel against terrorists and others who threaten the safety of the traveling public and the security of our nation. Chairman DeSantis, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Lynch, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to testify. Let me clarify that I came back before the Super Bowl. I did not stay for the Super Bowl.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson, you're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Meadows, Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Connolly, and Ranking Member Lynch, and distinguished members of the committee. I did not go to the Super Bowl either. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today on implementation of the Visa Waiver Program Improvement and Terrorist Travel Prevention Act of 2015. It's a pleasure to be here today with Commissioner Kurlikowski. My written statement describes how the Department of State has worked closely with the Department of Homeland Security to implement this new law while ensuring our top priority remains the protection of the U.S. homeland. As Deputy Coordinator for Homeland Security and State's Counterterrorism Bureau, the security of the homeland and the safety of our citizens is my constant focus. I welcome this legislation to strengthen the Visa Waiver Program. The VWP is a key counterterrorism tool that helps protect our homeland every single day. Our VWP partners must uphold strict security standards, such as sharing information on known and suspected terrorists and criminals, and reporting lost and stolen passports to Interpol. We use VWP benefits to encourage greater information sharing and more systemic screening by our allies. VWP requirements give our partners the impetus to tighten security in ways that can be politically challenging for them. The U.S. government assesses each VWP country's compliance at least once every 2 years, inspecting airports, seaports, land borders, and passport production and issuance facilities. No other program enables the U.S. government to conduct such broad and consequential assessments of foreign partners' security operations. I'd also like to underscore that the VWP is not a free pass to travel to the United States. All travelers coming to the United States undergo checks for ties to terrorism and are subject to multiple layers of security, regardless of whether they have a visa or they enter under the VWP. As the commissioners noted, citizens of VWP countries apply to the United States via the ESTA, and CBP checks ESTA forms against U.S. terrorist and criminal databases before travelers are allowed to travel under the VWP. And that information our partners provide us as part of the VWP is a vital component of our terrorist and criminal databases. The layered security continues beyond this step. All travelers are screened by CBP's National Targeting Center before they board an airplane and after they're admitted into the U.S., and ESTAs are continuously reviewed and revoked immediately if new intelligence comes to light. Watch listing and screening and intelligence gathering are some of our best tools for countering terrorist travel. These tools are most effective when we're working in collaboration with our VWP partners, and that's an important counterterrorism partnership, the VWP. The 38 countries that are part of the VWP include many of our closest allies, and they're proud of their status. VWP membership is so prized that many countries not in the VWP complete program requirements in the hope of joining the program. I'd like to speak to the national security waivers authorized under the law. Under the new law, the Secretary of Homeland Security has the authority to waive restrictions if he determines that such a waiver is in the law enforcement or national security interests of the United States. We understand that Congress did not want to create blanket exemptions to the law, and that is why these waivers will be implemented on a case-by-case basis. After consulting with the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Homeland Security has determined that as a general matter, it is in the national security interests of the United States to administer waivers on a case-by-case basis for certain types of ESTA applicants. I want to stress again that these are not blanket waivers. Again, the waivers would be administered on a case-by-case basis and are narrowly tailored to specific national security interests. We publicly outline these categories in which a waiver might apply to provide guidance to citizens of VWP countries. There's a lot of confusion about this law among some of our closest allies and trading partners. We need to let them know which of their citizens might receive a waiver and how that process would work. We noted in our guidance that each ESTA applicant would be considered on a case-by-case basis. In no instance is travel guaranteed under the VWP if a person falls into one of these identified categories. I'd like to share quickly some examples of why we think these narrowly tailored waivers are in our national security interest. For instance, we rely on employees of the International Atomic Energy Agency for the technical expertise to fight the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. Yet without a waiver, IAEA employees who went to Iran to pursue our national security objective of preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon will be considered security risks. Without waivers, UNHCR and World Food Program staff who do critical work helping refugees in Iraq or feeding starving children in Darfur, Sudan would be unable to travel to the United States under the VWP. The European Union is an essential partner to us around the world, but without a waiver, representatives from the EU, including EU parliamentarians, would be ineligible to travel to the US under the VWP. Additionally, we work closely with officials of the EU Counterterrorism Coordinator's Office, who travel frequently to Iraq. Without waivers, they would be denied ESTAs. And these waivers would allow us to maintain and build our relationships and cooperations with these institutions toward shared counterterrorism goals. Business representatives or NGO employees who have traveled to Iraq to help with schools, roads, and hospitals would be denied travel under VWP, even though they're only doing work we have encouraged to help stabilize and rebuild that country's economy. In Syria, the world relies on journalists facing great danger to report human rights violations, allegations of chemical weapon use, and brutality of that ongoing conflict that we might otherwise not know about. Yet without waivers, they too would be denied travel under the VWP. I recognize that participating in the VWP is a privilege and not a right, but denying VWP participation to citizens of member countries who are doing work we promote and support is counter to our national security interests. I want to stress again that every VWP traveler considered for a waiver will be closely examined to see if they meet the stringent requirements to travel under the VWP. A case-by-case application of waivers in these narrow instances allows us to advance our national security interests and direct our resources to higher-risk threats. As I've discussed, we believe there are significant national security interests for the United States to utilize this waiver authority, and we can do so without compromising the safety of our fellow citizens at home and overseas and the security of the traveling public. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member DeSantis, Ranking Member Connolly, and Ranking Member Lynch, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Vaughn for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Last year, Congress passed the first meaningful improvements to the visa waiver program in some time, in acknowledgement of the elevated threat we face now from terrorism, espionage, and the inappropriate transfer of technology. These sensible and modest changes will allow for more scrutiny of certain travelers coming from visa waiver program countries based on their dual nationality or their travel history by requiring them to get a visa. This is important because the visa application process is not overly burdensome, but it does offer the opportunity for much more review than is possible under the visa waiver program for several reasons. Because the visa process gives the government the time and the opportunity to ask questions and to ascertain more about the applicant's credibility and purpose for travel. The ESTA, on the other hand, is filled out online and people can submit it just hours before departure. The opportunity is for other agencies to help review these applications if needed, whether it's through the Security Advisory Opinion process or other consultation with experts at Post, in which DHS, FBI, intelligence agencies, Treasury officials, Department of Commerce, and others can review the applications if the consular department feels it needs that additional consultation. The ink from the President's signature on the law was barely dry when the Obama administration significantly undermined these reforms by unilaterally offering waivers that were not explicitly authorized in the law. This is a problem, not only because it is a flagrant abuse of executive authority and a breach of the agreement with Congress, but because the administration's plan will expose our nation to real threats. One of the categories of travelers the administration has carved out for waivers, dual nationals traveling to Iran and Iraq for business purposes, is precisely the category of travelers that needs to be scrutinized more closely because of past cases of espionage and illegal technology transfer. The risks inherent in the visa waiver program are compounded by the President's tendency to allow the admission of increasing number of foreign visitors, to gloss over the threats, to oversell his agency's ability to screen out risks, and to suppress the enforcement of immigration laws in the interior. I believe there were sound reasons to impose these restrictions. The immigration systems of Europe and the United States have already been exploited by terrorists with European citizenship and other dual nationalities linked to terrorism and other illicit activity that threatens national security. Congressional leaders are rightfully angry about this move. The law provided the executive branch with the authority to issue waivers only for those dual nationals who were serving in military or civilian government jobs, not for journalists, aid workers, or business travelers necessarily. One of my main concerns is that the visa waiver program is already a major national security vulnerability that needs to be addressed. There are thousands of individuals who are involved with or sympathetic to terror groups in countries that sponsor terror who also hold passports of countries that participate in the visa waiver program who can travel to the U.S. without undergoing the scrutiny of a visa interview. Since 2014, there have been more than 100 foreign-born individuals who've been arrested for involvement in a terror operation after being admitted to the U.S. And DHS has yet to disclose the manner of entry for most of them, but we do know that terrorists have used the VWP to enter in the past. My organization has identified more than 50 naturalized U.S. citizens who've been charged with serious national security-related offenses, such as terrorism, spying, and theft of sensitive information and technology. Many were already associated with terror groups or foreign intelligence when they naturalized. 8 were born in Iran, and their crimes included exporting sensitive equipment, military equipment, satellite technology, and so on. So clearly, dual nationality is a vital and frequently used tool for terror and espionage operations. The number of Visa Waiver Program entries has been rising significantly. In 2014, more than 20 million visitors were admitted under that program, which is a 24% increase since 2008. And that means many more people who need to be vetted by our screening systems and by CBP inspectors. We know that the Visa Waiver Program is frequently abused. In fact, Visa Waiver overstays make up 29% of the total number of overstays by visitors who were admitted under the short-term B1, B2 category in 2015. The total number of Visa Waiver Program overstays just in 2015 was more than 150,000. And these overstayers, we also know, are not a high priority for ICE. Only about 1% are ever investigated and fewer deported. The other main concern I have is that one of the categories of travelers carved out for waivers is dual nationals traveling to Iran and Iraq for business purposes. And that's a category of travelers that presents a significant national security risk because Iran has a comprehensive, effective, and aggressive intelligence program that expends substantial time and resources targeting U.S. military equipment, plans, and programs, as well as dual-use technology. It's not just reasonable but urgent that our government take the steps to address this vulnerability, and Congress has come up with a tool that, if anything, should be expanded, not scaled back. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Ottolenghi for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis and Meadows, ranking members Lynch and Connolly, members of the committee, on behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for the opportunity to testify. Entering to the United States under the Visa Waiver Program is a privilege, not a right, bestowed on a select group of countries. Today we discuss whether it is reasonable to require greater due diligence for a select group of visitors from Visa Waiver countries on the basis that they are dual nationals of Iran or a handful of other countries. Greater due diligence is, in my view, a sound and not unduly burdensome measure. Dual nationals can continue to travel to the United States provided they first apply in person and receive a visa. Many of us in this room have had to apply for visas to travel to other countries. While an annoyance, it is not an overly onerous exercise. In the case of Iranian dual nationals, this added layer of due diligence is critical to the national security of the United States. Tehran has long relied on dual nationals to pursue illegal activities. Clearly, not every dual national is a government agent, but virtually all agents of the Iranian regime who were involved in conspiracies to commit acts of terrorism or nuclear and ballistic procurement were dual passport holders. With effective enforcement, the visa waiver exception will make it more difficult for them to engage in criminal activities on American soil. Tehran relies on dual nationals because a non-Iranian passport generally draws less scrutiny at border crossings. It also makes it easier to open foreign bank accounts, incorporate companies, and conduct financial operations overseas. My written testimony provides 5 recent examples of dual nationals' critical role in Iran's terror plots. Here are examples of cases in which Tehran relied on dual nationals for other illicit activities and to obscure the Iranian ownership of companies. Slide 2, please. MCS Systems was a German gas cylinder factory owned by ICO, the Supreme Leaders holding company, which the U.S. Treasury sanctioned in 2013. ICO obfuscated its ownership by transferring it to 2 Iranian-Canadian dual nationals, who then reported directly to ICO. The goal, to attempt and evade sanctions. In 2010, Treasury sanctioned IFIC Holding, the German-based subsidiary of Iran's foreign investment company. Commercial extracts for Swifik Holding, its Swiss branch, show its owners were a Canadian and a German dual national. The goal again, avoid sanctions. Iran's airline Mahan Air provides more evidence of the role of dual nationals. Treasury designated Mahan Air in 2011, quote, for providing financial, material, and technological support to the Quds force, including transporting personnel and weapons to Syria's regime. Mahan relies on dual nationals to run its front companies in Europe while continuing to facilitate ethnic cleansing and other crimes against humanity in Syria. In most waiver countries, obtaining citizenship is a lengthy process with stringent requirements. Some countries, however, are making their citizenship readily available through investment. Iranian nationals, among others, are exploiting this. In 2014, the U.S. Treasury issued an advisory that certain individuals were abusing the Citizenship by Investment program of St. Kitts and Nevis to obtain passports for the purpose of engaging in illicit financial activity. The advisory made particular reference to Iranian nationals. 3 Iranian businessmen with quickly obtained St. Kitts citizenship built a complex financial sanctions evasion network spanning the globe, including the United States. Despite Treasury sanctions, they moved across borders easily and reconstituted sanctioned companies under new names thanks to their St. Kitts passport, and for one of them, a Canadian permanent residency. This is not an isolated case. New programs from visa waiver countries are now available to wealthy investors, including Iranians, in search for a second passport. Such programs may become a gateway to a visa-free entry into the United States for Iranian procurement agents. The lifting of sanctions against Iran may actually increase the number of regime agents trying to enter the U.S. The steps Congress now takes must ensure that actors involved in facilitating proliferation and other illicit activities abroad do not benefit from free access to the United States. The United States should explain to all visa waiver countries offering or considering citizenship and permanent residency by investment that the due diligence and stringency of the requirements of their programs may affect their status. Their programs should not become a shortcut to entering the United States. The suspension of the visa waiver program for dual nationals of Iran is the direct result of the regime's close association with terrorism and other illicit activities. The dangerous exploitation of foreign passports for illicit purposes justifies the inconvenience posed to the relatively few who will now have to obtain a visa in person. The singling out of Iranian dual nationals is thus not only appropriate, but should be a vital component of Homeland Security policy. My written testimony provides additional recommendations. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Heifetz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, Chairman Meadows, and Ranking Member Connolly. Thank you to all of the distinguished members of the subcommittees on national security and on government operations. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing about the visa waiver program. My name is Stephen Heifetz. I'm a partner at Steptoe & Johnson, an international law firm, and prior to joining Steptoe, I served from 2006 to 2010 in several positions at the Department of Homeland Security, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development, where I had oversight responsibility for the VWP. Under the VWP, DHS waives the B non-immigrant visa requirement for aliens traveling from 38 approved countries, all U.S. allies, to permit stays of up to 90 days for business or tourism. The effect of the waiver is that the standard visa interview by a U.S. consular officer, which generally requires the traveler to go to a consular office in person, is not required. This does not mean, however, that DHS waives security requirements for these travelers. In fact, under the VWP, DHS mandates additional, more stringent security requirements for both the individual traveler and his or her home country. The 38 U.S. allies that are VWP members must meet high security standards to enter and maintain membership in the VWP, and substantial checks are conducted on every traveler. The result is a system that provides as much security against terrorist or criminal travelers as the visa system. Nevertheless, many in the media and elsewhere have labored under the misapprehension that security standards have been looser for VWP travelers than for those traveling with a visa, and that this poses a threat to U.S. national security. At least since reforms implemented about a decade ago, that perception has been inaccurate. Security experts in both the Bush and Obama administrations have lauded the VWP as a good security program. But like any successful security program, the VWP has continued to be closely reviewed over the years, undergoing further reform as new threats are perceived. The most recent VWP statutory reforms were enacted as part of the 2016 Consolidated Appropriations Act in December 2015. Among other things, the new law generally precludes travel under the VWP for dual nationals of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Sudan. And further, the new law generally precludes travel under the VWP for those who have traveled to these countries. There are, however, exceptions for those who traveled to perform military service or other official duties of a VWP member country. In addition, the new law provides that the DHS Secretary may, with respect to any particular traveler, waive the prohibitions with regard to Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Sudan, if doing so is in the national security interests of the United States. Such a waiver would allow VWP travel to the U.S. by a citizen of a VWP member country, notwithstanding dual nationality or travel involving the 4 countries of concern. For example, a Japanese business person who travels to Iraq for business, or an Australian doctor who provides humanitarian aid in Syria, generally would be ineligible for VWP travel under the new law, but that ineligibility can be waived by the DHS Secretary. This national security waiver authority is important. Here's one illustration why. The United States and other world powers recently signed a momentous deal with Iran that addresses Iran's nuclear weapons program. Under this deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, European companies now will have regular business dealings with Iran. It's common and will become ever more common for a European business person to travel to Iran to conduct legitimate business. But if that European business person's travel will preclude further travel to the U.S. under the visa waiver program, that might deter European business dealings with Iran. If you are a Londoner or a Parisian sitting in London or Paris and considering traveling to Iran to scout a business deal, you might reconsider because of the potential loss of VWP privileges. As part of the JCPOA, though, the U.S. committed to refrain from creating new types of sanctions on Iran. More specifically, the U.S. agreed to refrain from, quoting from the JCPOA text, imposing exceptional or discriminatory regulatory and procedural requirements in lieu of the sanctions and restrictive measures covered by the JCPOA. Some have argued that this commitment necessitates U.S. waivers to allow legitimate business travel to Iran without the loss of VWP privileges. Even if one thinks the JCPOA was a bad deal, the administration fairly can claim that it is in the national security interest of the United States to ensure JCPOA compliance by Iran. And ensuring compliance is made much more difficult if Iran can allege that the U.S. has breached its obligations by creating obstacles to Iranian travel. That is one reason the administration should be granted deference in determining how to utilize the waiver authority under the new VWP law. And there are other reasons. There is a great need for humanitarian intervention in some of the 4 countries of concern, Syria and Iraq in particular. Without the exercise of waivers, the loss of VWP privileges may deter needed humanitarian travel to these countries. The Australian doctor who wants to offer medical services in Syria may reconsider if doing so will cause a loss of VWP privileges. Such thinking could, ironically, have adverse effects on U.S. security. More fundamentally, waivers that allow travel under the VWP should not cause undue concerns because the VWP fundamentally is a strong security program. I've alluded to that previously and discussed it in more detail in my formal written testimony. You have other witnesses today who can speak to the operational security of the VWP, so I'll close my verbal testimony and would be happy to address questions.
Thank you. The Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Ms. Johnson, as a general matter, requiring a foreign national traveling to the United States to obtain a visa, how does that damage national security?
Thank you, sir. As I mentioned in my remarks, the VWP is a very important and significant counterterrorism tool. The security requirements under the VWP...
That's not my question. I'm saying, you're saying some people may be ineligible for the VWP. So my question is, okay, that means they would have to get a visa. So the requirement to get a visa, how does that damage national security?
So citizens of those VWP countries are suddenly treated as a heightened security risk. So what we've heard from our European colleagues in particular, just even yesterday.
Well, okay, yes, but why? I mean, you have some of these people in like Brussels and some of these jihadist-infested areas. I mean, why would we not want to treat them as a heightened security?
Well, again,
They are a heightened security risk, aren't they?
Well, these waivers are, again, very limited and very narrowly focused and would be done on a case-by-case basis. And again, at those categories of travelers we were looking at is not somebody who would just go to Syria to go visit, perhaps, and go attend a terrorist training camp. We're looking at, again, limited and very focused waiver categories that's permissible under the law.
Well, I think that the testimony alluded to, so under the administration's action with respect to the visa waiver changes that were enacted by Congress, they would allow somebody who was a national of, say, Iran and a European country who qualified under the visa waiver program, if that Iranian national was traveling back to Iran to do business, even though the businesses may have connections with the Revolutionary Guard Corps, they would qualify under the business exemption, correct?
No, that's not.
Why
the
not?
answer. So again, these are limited case by case. They would be focused on being reviewed. And again, these individuals are going to be screened against all of our databases, again, with information provided by the VWP countries.
Well, but that, I think that's the issue, is that the reason why you want someone to obtain a visa, I mean, if we're confident that everyone is a threat that's in the database, then you're right, there are certain things that could catch them at an airport. But the whole idea is, you have someone like Tashfeen Malik, she didn't pop on those databases. We were hoping that that visa process that she went through would have ferreted her out and would not have allowed her entry into the United States. And so let me just return just as a general, because I don't think I got a clear answer. Israel, not visa waiver country. Azerbaijan, Shiite Muslim ally of ours. Iran, they don't like that Shiite Muslim government. They're not on the visa waiver program. So how does it damage national security to require travelers from those areas to get a visa?
I'm not sure I understand the linkage with Israel and Azerbaijan.
Just there's different countries that we're allies with, sure, where their citizens have to get a visa in order to come here that are not under the visa waiver program. So my question is why not err on the side of caution? And if you require someone to get a visa, how does that fact damage our national security?
So again, these visa waiver partner countries, their citizens are being treated as a heightened security concern, and we're looking at not damage, we're leveraging the program to get additional information sharing requirements. We go and review examine their seaports, their land borders, their airports. We're getting more out of the visa waiver program as a counterterrorism tool than perhaps what we would be doing with a non-VWP partner. So again, I think that we're looking at the fact that we're treating these individuals as heightened security risks, and we're utilizing this waiver to look at a narrower group.
But I get,
and those countries may not cooperate with us as a counterterrorism matter if there's
which countries have indicated that?
Well, we've had a number who have been very concerned. Again, yesterday.
Which ones?
I've met with the Swiss, I've met with the French, I've met with the EU, I've met with Japan. They've all expressed concerns that, as Mr. Heifetz has mentioned, that they may actually choose not to come to the United States because they're concerned, or not go to Iran, or they might not go to Iraq, participate in a humanitarian mission because they're concerned about this, that they're being treated, their citizens are being treated as a heightened security risk. Our VWP program is going under, every traveler under the VWP program is going under heightened security screening, just like they will with visas. So I take issue that the fact that they don't get an SAO review, they do. They don't get an automatic ESTA just because they've applied and answered questions. Every one of those individuals are completely scrubbed against our screening databases before being issued an ESTA, and then those ESTAs are reviewed continually.
So, yes, they're traveling to Iran. Some of them are doing business with Iran. Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. The State Department considers the government of Iran to be a state sponsor of terrorism. The Revolutionary Guard Corps is a designated terrorist group. So, yes, they'd be treated differently, but aren't there legitimate reasons why they should be treated differently given the circumstances? I mean, if Japanese citizens going to Taiwan to do business, the idea that that was going to affect the visa waiver status, I mean, I get that. But when you're traveling to Iran, given the circumstances, how is it unreasonable to think that that would be something that we would be concerned about?
Again, individuals from the VWP countries going and conducting legitimate business in Iran that's permissible under the JCPOA shouldn't be penalized or shouldn't be considered a heightened risk. Of course, again, we would do all of the routine screening on each individual to ensure that they are not a threat to the United States.
So you're worried about penalizing someone going to Iran to do business, even though that could potentially expose the American people to more danger. And I get like the visa waiver, the sharing of intelligence, I think that's good, but the bottom line is it is easier to come here if you qualify for a visa waiver. And if you're not in the database, I don't think that you're going to be able to be found out. My time is up. I'm going to recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's stay on that, Ms. Johnson. So a number of my colleagues have expressed concern that waivers could be granted to individuals for reasons that might run contrary to our national security interests, as required under the law. How do we what is the countermeasure against that within the system? How do we make sure, and look, I'm sort of the devil's advocate here. I spent a lot of the members on this committee spent a lot of time in the Middle East, so we understood. We just came back again from visiting all these refugee camps, been to Sudan, so I know, and that's on the list here too. Certainly understand all the huge number of NGOs that we have working in these countries on behalf of the American people, which the goal is to keep the refugees from flooding into Europe and elsewhere, this huge diaspora that's been created because of the war in Iraq and Syria. They're trying to keep them stable in safe conditions on the border. So as a result, we've got a lot of people. The USCIS does great work on our behalf. We've got a bunch of different, the World Food Program did great work. But we do have a lot of people that end up especially in Iraq. We've got tons of contractors that are going in and out of Iraq on a regular basis. How do we create a countermeasure within, and Mr. Heifetz, you might want to join in on this because your testimony speaks to this issue as well. How do we rest assured that someone's not breaching the visa waiver program with nefarious intent, that someone gets a waiver from the Secretary of DHS and does what these folks in Paris did or San Bernardino did?
Yeah, so again, the visa waiver program requires much more strict security standards. So all of the countries have to meet those strict security standards. Countries that don't have to have their citizens come get visas do not necessarily have those, they certainly don't have those standards that they're required to meet. So that's on the front end. And then we're inspecting those on a regular basis. It's important to stress that the information sharing that we get from them, the known and suspected terrorist information we receive from those VWP countries, again, enhances our screening databases. So we're getting more information through the VWP partnership than we would any other country relationship that we have outside the VWP. Then we have the additional layered security. So an individual who might be a humanitarian worker applying for an ESTA because they want to utilize this waiver, it should be important to note that they're not applying for the waiver, they're applying for the ESTA. So the ESTA then has more stringent questions. I would be frank, and we have only a couple minutes in a visa window. You're asking a number of questions through the ESTA process, which we then work really hard to verify. We also screen against all of our databases, both terrorism and criminal. And then for all travelers, whether they're visa or traveling under the visa or the VWP, we have layered security portions, again, to ensure we're not having people enter the United States that should do us harm.
Okay, so we, in the past, and I want to ask you about the lists, we had a situation where there were some workers, I believe about 72 workers, that went through DHS screening and were able to obtain security badges to work in secure areas of our airports, yet they were on the TIDE list. They were on one of our terrorist lists. Has that been straightened out? Because earlier on, DHS and people weren't sharing lists, and that was the root cause of that problem. Now, I've been reassured in other forums that problem's been addressed and the lists are being shared, so that's not going to happen anymore. Is that your understanding, Mr. Kurlikowski?
So TSA runs that part of the program, and Admiral Neffinger, and I know that they have just gone back under his direction and completely rescreened all of those individuals against all of these different databases. They've rescreened all of these individuals as a result of that. There's another group, of course, that works on the ports and the cargo crane and operators of other equipment. That is run through the United States Coast Guard, and as I understand it, they are also in that process. But within DHS and our partner government agencies, especially under the National Targeting Center, I would tell you that there is no database that cannot be shared and is not run against others.
Okay. I see my time has expired. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
Ms. Johnson, you say you're going to do these waivers on a case-by-case basis, so I guess you've got a criteria set for how they get a waiver or not?
I think that would be more of a question for DHS in the process of how those waivers are administered.
So is there a criteria?
There's a system that by February 23rd that will have all of these additional questions. For instance, if you were doing a legitimate business in Iran, you would have to, of course, had an Iranian business passport with those numbers. So there'll be a whole
What part of the
series
law,
to
I
review it.
guess, talked about business purposes, having a waiver?
So the protocol would be that if you were claiming that you wished under, and by the way, no waiver has been granted and no waiver.
Right, but it's a national security or law enforcement waiver. It was fairly clear, wasn't it? National security or law enforcement waiver. Isn't that right, Ms. Johnson?
It is correct.
Okay, so how can you quantify that a business purpose is a national security purpose?
So I think there are.
I'm a business guy, and I mean, so that means I'm a national security risk.
Or a national security benefit.
Because what I'm hearing, and let me tell you what troubles me, it sounds like we've created a jobs program for Iran, that we're concerned about their business activity at the expense of the national security of all freedom-loving Americans. Have we done that? Because that's what Mr. Heifetz indicated. It's important for their economy. So is that what we've done, Ms. Johnson? We've created a jobs program?
No, sir,
Then why do we give an exception according to DHS? I guess the exception is for legitimate business purposes, and it's not just in Iran, it's in Iraq, and they're not part of the agreement in terms of the JCPOA. So why would we include Iraq and Syria and Sudan if it's not trying to help them get investors from Europe?
Well, under the business, it's only Iraq and Iran, and we certainly want to see Iraq's economy do.
So it is a jobs program.
Well, we certainly want to see Iraq's economy do better so that they can support their own defense.
But I can tell you that was nowhere in the deliberations between the minority or the majority. When we were talking about this, it had nothing to do with business purposes. So how does the administration start to interpret this law as somehow being a jobs program? Ms. Johnson?
Again, it's not a jobs program. It's not about Iran. It's not about Iran. It's about our national security. And I work in the Counterterrorism Bureau at the State Department, and so I'm very focused on the fact that the protection of the homeland, which the entire State Department is focused on, is one of our major priorities.
So wouldn't allowing more business travelers who travel from Belgium or France going to Iran potentially create a greater national security threat than if they never traveled there at all? I'm not talking about the visa waiver program because I know you've been defaulting that. Could it not potentially create a greater national security threat?
I don't see the connection in the sense that these are under the JCPOA. These countries can't.
No, one of them is. Not all those countries are under that. Am I confused? Or are they all under that? I thought only a few of those were. Like one.
The program, the VWP partnership, again, for us with our partners under the VWP program, they
That's
can
different.
go.
That's different than what you just said, though. I understand. So if the VWP program is all great, why don't we expand it to all the countries if it actually increases our national security? Why don't we increase it to Israel?
I would think that, there, again,
Aren't they
there
an
are
ally?
countries that want
They're
to
a
be
closer
part-
ally than Iran, aren't they?
Well, there's requirements to get into the program, a number of factors.
But Iran hasn't met those requirements. Have they?
It's in visa,
But
not about Iran.
but they're enjoying the benefit. Let me go on. I got a few minutes left. For DHS, the report that you sent only had 2 of 70 types of visas. Is there any reason why we excluded the other 68 types on that report?
So we were given this mission, the entry-exit mission by Congress in 2013.
Oh, no. There's a GAO report. You were given the mission back in the 1990s.
I'm sorry, I'm speaking as the Commissioner of Customs and Border.
Okay. Your agency.
Right. We were given that mission in 2013. And as you know, there had not been a visa waiver overstay report for many, many, many years.
1994.
Right, until last year. It was very clear that there was a lot.
Well, there hasn't still been one. Let's be clear about that. We've had a partial report.
I'll agree that certainly a partial report. It is certainly a step ahead and a step better than what had ever been issued before under many administrations.
Well, that's true because it hadn't been issued in 20 years. So, I mean, something is always better than nothing. I guess when are we going to get the full report?
So the full report and the number of things, and we'd be happy to spend some time with you or your staff briefing you about all the things that DHS and Customs and Border Protection is doing to try to increase the quality of the data. You know that an overstay, if you leave the country one day after your visa expired, you're considered an overstay even though you have left the country.
Yeah, but that's not the numbers we're talking about. Let's don't give a false premise here. And if the chair will indulge this last clarifying question. We have reason to believe that the number of overstays, if you include all the categories, is closer to 750,000 versus the 500,000 that has been indicated. Would you agree with that, that estimate? Have you seen any estimate?
I don't know. I have not.
All right. Now yield back.
Chairman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Just for the record, Mr. Kurlikowski, Ms. Johnson, you aren't in some secret conspiracy to allow terrorists to come into the United States, are you?
No, sir.
No, sir.
And you're both under oath?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you. Okay. I just want to make sure, because sometimes in listening to some of the criticism, one would draw perhaps a strange conclusion. Mr. Heifetz, were you advocating for a jobs program through the use of this program in Iran?
No, I was not.
What were you advocating or digressing about?
Ensuring that was suggesting that the administration needs deference in the exercise of the national security exemption, among other things, to ensure that all sides to the JCPOA are compliant.
Might there be unintended consequences with the law we passed in December? Could there be, people caught up in it that we didn't intend to, or presumably didn't intend to be caught up in it?
Yes.
Could an IAEA inspector, for example, critical to validating compliance with the JCPOA, that is to say the nuclear agreement with Iran, could they be caught up in the net unwittingly?
Yes.
So we might want to make an exception there.
For sure.
Mr. Lynch talked about going to refugee camps. So, for example, the Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, or UN officials who are doing humanitarian work, certainly something we would laud. We might want to give due deference to the administration in making sure they're not unwittingly caught up in this law and prevented from coming into the United States through the waiver program. Would that be a fair statement?
That seems sensible.
Ms. Johnson, is that of concern to the State Department? Are there some unintended consequences from a law we passed that you're trying to address through implementation, as well as Mr. Kurlikowski at DHS?
Yes, again, with our foreign partners who feel that those individuals are being considered a heightened security risk, yes.
Our foreign partners, that is to say, they're concerned about this.
Yes, and we're...
So there are foreign policy relations that could also be at risk because we've maybe passed a law with good intent and out of deep concern to protect the country, but there may be some unforeseen aspects of that law, consequences of that law, that could affect our partners, our allies, and we need to address that. Otherwise, we're needlessly alienating friends and partners we need in other endeavors. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, and for the national security of the United States, we rely on those partners to help protect the U.S. homeland.
Right. Are there any such partners who have publicly called for us to make adjustments because of those concerns?
I would have to get back to you, but I know the EU has themselves, I believe, sent a letter to the Speaker of the House.
Okay, so it's not an idle speculation. We actually have a record of concern by Europe, not a trivial partner or ally. Okay. The issue of dual nationals, and I know it's been addressed, but is there another side, either Mr. Kurlikowski or Ms. Johnson, to the debate on dual nationality? Because I can tell you in my district, there are certain ethnic groups who are apoplectic about the application of this law because they feel they're unwitting victims and they're not terrorists, though they may be of a certain national background that would fall under the penumbra of this law. Is there some rationale, and I invite you too, Mr. Heifetz, is there some rationale for why we might want to make exception for dual nationals?
So we're reviewing that internally right now in consultation, working closely with the Department of Homeland Security. I do know the Europeans have also been expressively very concerned about that, feeling that the law was discriminatory. And I think, and CBP can, the Commissioner can confirm, I think some of the biggest dual national populations come out of Britain, Australia, some of our key allies.
But we implemented that particular facet of the law almost immediately by canceling 17,000 dual national that we had information on. And we've also, any application that has come in since that it also shows dual nationality has been denied. And of course, our default position on all of this, whether it's with a potential waiver application or not, is that if there is any derogatory information, any concern, or anything that would violate the law that Congress passed and the President signed, the default position would be to deny them and send them.
I think that's really important. My time's up, and I thank the chair. But the default, when in doubt, we don't do it. We don't put the United States at risk. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, all of you, for being here today. The difficulty that obviously a lot of us face on all sides of the immigration issue is not conflating refugee resettlement with visa waiver, with border security, with a larger immigration issue. I think many times we tend to get all of that confused. However, here we're talking about specifically a vulnerability. Second only to the open border that we have in ways that people could infiltrate, the visa waiver program constitutes probably the greatest threat for infiltration if you were trying to enter the United States to do nefarious activities. In a simple yes or no, would you agree or disagree with that statement, Mr. Kurlikowski?
I would not agree with it, no.
Ms. Johnson?
I would not agree as well.
Ms. Vaughn?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Mr. Ottolenghi?
So would I.
Mr. Heifetz?
I disagree.
Okay. And see, therein lies the problem, because even in the refugee camps that we visited, even as we've traveled into some very dangerous places to look at a lot of different things, even they will build up their border so that we have a controlled entry. Now, visa waivers, we have control, and I hear cited here today that it is the ESTA that is far more stringent, and it's far more thorough, and therefore we should have some reassurance. Ms. Johnson, how long is the ESTA legitimate for?
I believe it's 2 years. It's good for 3, and it can go down to 1.
So 2 to 3 years. So do you think that maybe someone could be in a different viewpoint in terms of nefarious activity over a 2-year period?
Well, just like our visas, the ESTAs are currently vetted, so it's not a static moment in time. So just because you're issued an ESTA does not mean we don't continually look at you as.
Well, I understand that, but unless the information is volunteered, such as a change of address or some other nature, the ESTA is good for 2 years. And, you know, whether or not I am coming here to visit Disneyland or coming here to commit an act of terror, we don't know. And see, here's part of the problem. Now, I'm not conflating the refugee resettlement and some of those. Look, we need to be a nation that welcomes immigrants. I just want to be on the record for that. However, what we're talking about here is a vulnerability to infiltration. And as someone who defended my country in uniform for more than 2 decades of my life, living among many of the places that we're talking about, by the way, which have very good people, we are vulnerable. And yet, Mr. Heifetz, let me see if I'm correct here. You say, as part of the JCPOA, though, the United States committed to refrain from creating new types of sanctions on Iran. More specifically, the U.S. agreed to refrain from, quote, imposing exceptional or discriminatory regulatory and procedural requirements in lieu of the sanctions and restrictive measures covered by the JCPOA. So am I hearing you correctly that modifications to the visa waiver should be avoided because it might curtail Iranian business? Yes or no?
No, that's not what I was saying.
But that's in multiple statements, to include your recorded testimony. You do state that we should avoid that because it might be discriminatory or exceptional. Do you believe that it's discriminatory or exceptional to have an additional scrutiny on Iranian people conducting Iranian business?
I believe that we have to be very careful about the exercise of VWP privileges and the withdrawal of those VWP privileges, and that we need that it is in the United States' national security interest to ensure compliance with the JCPOA.
Well, okay, but that's a whole separate issue with the joint agreement. In fact, let's talk about trading allies. Our top 20 allies, GDP, okay, China, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong, Malaysia, these are in the top 20 trading partners. We're talking a lot of money, hundreds of billions of dollars in trade, the United States. They're not on the visa waiver program. Are you suggesting, sir, that Iran should be treated more favorably, or those that do business with Iran, than, say, if I were a Londoner and I visited Malaysia?
No.
Are you suggesting that I ought to get favorable attention because I'm going to Iran as opposed to our allies that we trade hundreds of billions of dollars with?
The U.S. security depends in large part on cooperation from, among others, European allies. And if we threaten withdrawal of VWP privileges from citizens of those countries, that's something that has to be factored into the calculation.
Well, I agree, and I understand a little bit about security and providing security to the United States, having nearly lost my life in defense of the country. How would requiring additional screening on a visa application for those conducting business in Iran be any different than, say, exceptions to conduct business with Saudi Arabia? Do you favor Iran over Saudi Arabia?
I've not taken any position on that.
Well, I think you are,
issue.
sir. I think you are taking a position here
No.
with your testimony here today. And this is the point that I'm making. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. But we have to be very careful here. We have vulnerabilities. We want to be a nation that is welcoming. We have vulnerabilities. But as Mr. Ottolenghi correctly stated, this is not an additional burden. It is not so bad that we can't do it. And I think we need to be very careful before we open ourselves up to real danger and real vulnerability. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman, and thank you and Mr. Meadows for putting this hearing together. Mr. Kurlikowski, a couple months ago we had individual from DHS here, and we asked her a number of questions, and she wasn't able to give us any answers. Some of them didn't deal directly, and I'm going to ask you some of the same questions. They didn't deal directly with the visa waiver program, but information I think the American public is interested in knowing. So I'm going to ask you some of the same ones to see if you have the answers. Do you know how many Americans have traveled to Syria in the past 2 years?
I do not.
And who would have that information, and
Within DHS headquarters, there is a visa waiver office, and they're also, they would work with the Department of State on that information. We have a fairly narrow mission.
I'm talking about just
Customs
Americans who've traveled
Border
to
Protection.
Syria, people who've left our country to travel. Do we know that number?
Well, if you're also,
Not necessarily visa waiver program folks, but just
I think
anyone.
you'd get the numbers from the FBI and the National Counterterrorism Center. I know last year, so it was over 100. I don't know what the numbers are today.
Okay, and so over 100. And of those who, do we know how many of those 100 who've traveled there who've then come back?
if you're talking about those that may do harm and we're concerned about and may come back, I think whether it's the DNI or others, I think we would be much more comfortable in a closed setting giving you that information. But
I'm not asking whether they're going to do harm or not. I'm just asking, do we know Americans who've traveled to Syria, Iraq, Syria, Iraq, and then have come back? Do we know that number?
we do know that number.
Okay. But you don't
I
think we
would
should
not
give that in a
because I would
non-classified?
tell you that I think that there is a significant heightened risk
Okay.
unless there is particular information that they went over as a medical worker, et cetera.
Understand.
So we'd be more comfortable telling you that
Okay.
in a closed setting.
So let's go to, do we know how many Syrian refugees are in the country today? Again, not the visa waiver program, I'm talking about Syrian refugees. And Ms. Johnson or whoever, either one.
And I think that USCIS, the director, Leon Rodriguez, that is something that would be within his portfolio, not Customs and Border Protection.
Okay. All right, let's go to visa waiver program. How many visa waiver program overstays are there currently in the United States?
The number of overstays was estimated in the last report, and as Chairman Meadows mentioned.
This is the most recent report that you
Right,
guys just put together?
Exactly.
Okay. What was that number again?
Over 500,000 overstays.
Over 500,000. And what's the average length of time they've overstayed?
I don't have that.
Is it in the report?
I believe it is.
Okay. And of those 500,000 overstays, do we know how many of those may have been to Syria or Iraq in the past couple of years? I mean, do you know their travel history? So they're coming from largely, most likely a European country who are part of the visa waiver program. Do we know of those 500,000 who are here, who've overstayed the time they were supposed to be here, do we know how many of those may have traveled to Syria or Iraq?
If we have the information from an air manifest or a sea manifest as to whether or not they had traveled to another country, we would have that information, and I'd be happy to try and provide more detail. I wouldn't have that right in front of me.
But you do think you have, you could get me that information?
I could get you much more specifics to what you're asking than what I can tell you right now.
Well, I think that's an important question. I mean, because if you got 500,000 people who are overstaying the time that they're supposed to be here, we want to know where they came from. We want to know where they've traveled. I mean, the whole idea is that this visa waiver program could be exploited by terrorists. Be interesting to know if some of the people who are currently here who have overstayed have already violated what the agreement is, what the law is, if they've been to places in the Middle East prior to coming to the United States.
And we also know that in order for a country to remain in the visa waiver program, there has to be a percentage, an overstay percentage, I believe is below 3%.
Wait, say that again?
So all these countries that are in the visa waiver program do a whole host of things that they share information.
Right.
Whether it's lost or stolen
Understand.
passports, on and on. They also have to abide by a reduced amount of people that would be in an overstay capacity. That would be one of the criteria.
Okay, so that sort of raises the question then of these 500,000 people who are here who aren't supposed to be here. What kind of ramifications or consequences do the countries that they came from, what kind of consequences have happened?
Well, I would tell you that
It's one thing to say there are going to be consequences. We want to know for the 500,000 who are here who aren't supposed to be here, have there been any consequences?
well, I would tell you that the 500,000 people includes the people that got on the plane and left the day after their overstay. And I think, as Chairman Meadows mentioned, that there's a lot of gaps in that data. I mean, that's why I think it took so many years for people to try and gather it and put it together. That's why I was very pleased that Secretary Johnson, working with us and other parts of the DHS headquarters, were able to put together a report. And as I think all of us have clearly mentioned, there are gaps in the report. The data gathering needs to be better, and the information needs to be supplied not just to the members of Congress, but also to the American public. None of us disagree with that.
I'm over time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Heiss for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
would you allow just a quick clarification?
sure.
I thank the chair and thank Mike. It would be helpful, Mr. Kurlikowski, if we had some specified data on overstays. So your point is some people are classified overstays technically because a few hours lapse between the expiration of the visa and they're getting on an airplane and leaving. I think it would be helpful to the committee if we actually had breakdown of that data. So otherwise, we're dealing with the raw data of 500,000, which is not accurate, but what is accurate? And I think that's where Mr. Jordan was going.
If I could, Mr. Chairman?
Yep.
Yeah, great point. We'd like to break down that, but I think it's also important for the committee to understand, my understanding is that 500,000 is only the tourists and business, right? There's all kinds of other people here on visas who overstay, may not be in the visa waiver program, but there's all kinds of others. So that number is just with those two programs, and we can't even get the exact information where they've traveled before and what may have transpired there.
You're absolutely correct, Congressman. For instance, student visas. But student visas aren't for 90 days. Student visas are for the completion of the educational requirement. As we know, any of us who have sent our kids to college know they don't graduate in 4 years. So there's significant greater difficulties. All of us at DHS and
So
certainly
that's a good point, but they may not graduate in 4 years, but they're not our kids aren't breaking the law if they'd stay longer than 4 years. That's the point, right?
Well, actually,
They're breaking our wallet, but not breaking the law.
They're not breaking the law because they're not breaking the law if they stay 4.5 years to get that college education, because it's at the end of the term, at the end of the time. But you can see the difficulty of trying to track somebody for 4.5 years. So that's why the B1, B2 visa, I think, was easier.
I'm not saying it's not difficult. All I'm saying is we want the numbers, and frankly, that's your job to know what's going on and know those who are overstaying their time.
And though, I think of the 500,000 identified, I think you have the vast majority, like 416,000, are still in the country overstaying. And there's only a very small fraction that were investigated by ICE for overstaying. So I think that we need the data, I agree, but there's a lot of more questions to have answered. So Mr. Heiss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, we have by Congress given some restrictions to the visa waiver program. Ms. Johnson, let me ask you this. Did the administration discuss the exceptions to these restrictions with the government of Iran before announcing those exceptions to Congress and the American people?
Are you referring to a conversation between, or a letter between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif?
I'm referring to any communication with the Iranian government about the exceptions.
So I know that Secretary Kerry did send a letter to Foreign Minister Zarif after the Iranians publicly claimed that this law violated the JCPOA commitments. In that letter, Secretary Kerry defended the law, telling him that it was not a violation of the JCPOA commitments. He also outlined the fact of what the law was, again, defending the law, but also outlined why it was not in the violation of those commitments, because it is possible for Europeans to travel to Iran and conduct legitimate business.
So there was communication. Can we have a copy of that letter if we don't already have it, Mr. Chairman? That'd be entered in the record.
And these are letters, I mean, we've gotten similar letters from our VWP, or similar inquiries. Again, I've met with...
Okay, it's concerning to me that Congress passes restrictions and then the administration has conversations with the Iranian government and makes exceptions to the restrictions that were imposed by law, by Congress. I'd like to have a copy of that. You mentioned also a little while ago the legitimate business-related purposes. I have absolutely no idea what that means. What's the definition? How is that defined?
Well, obviously, legitimate business, we are working through how we would process that in the context of the waivers, but obviously, in the case of Iran, it would not be sanctionable, things that are sanctionable under both U.S. law and regulations, UN Security Council resolutions, things of those natures. That would be our basis for starting out.
So you're saying you don't have a real firm definition either?
Definitely from the sanctionable side, obviously, and then we would be looking at how we could also narrow down a review of those individual case-by-case waivers to determine legitimate business.
I just don't understand how someone with a so-called legitimate business-related purpose, how that business, someone traveling to Iran or Iraq or wherever it may be, somehow falls under a national security exemption. And can you explain that?
For both Iraq and Iran? Or,
Sure.
Yeah. So obviously, in the case of Iraq, we have been encouraging governments from VWP countries, but more broadly, more globally, to engage in business with Iraq to help stabilize their economy. That's in our national security interests. For Iran, the same thing. We're looking at these foreign partners, in particular the VWP countries, to engage in, they've got legitimate business interests and permissible under the JCPOA. Again, that's why we have a deadline of July 14th when it was concluded. Not before. And those are international security interests, those partners to be able to participate in that activity. These are partners, again, who are contributing to our national security. By participating in the VWP program, they're providing us with additional information on known and suspected terrorists. We also have information on how they do border controls, both at their sea and land and airports. And again, we are constantly monitoring our partnerships with those countries to make sure that it's securing the homeland and it's not undermining our security.
Thank you. Let me go to Mr. Kurlikowski. The Department of Homeland Security, are they currently monitoring individuals who have traveled to countries like Syria, Iraq, some of these other countries where there is known radicalization and training efforts that are ongoing in those countries? Are those individuals being monitored?
We would not do that. The Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation would be in a much better position to answer that. We do share...
Is there anyone on the panel that can answer that? So we have experts here. We don't know whether these people traveling to these countries where there's radicalization taking place, we don't know if they're being monitored.
Well, actually, the Department of Justice could answer it in a closed session with probably far more specificity.
But none of you can answer it, so that's not public knowledge. We don't know. Is that?
We would not want to release information or talk about the number of people or who is being monitored, who may pose a threat to the people of this country. All right,
my time is almost gone. Then let me just, since you can't answer that, let me ask it this way. Is there any way for the U.S. government to prevent individuals from visa waiver countries where there is radicalization and training, terroristic training taking place? Is there any way to ensure that these individuals cannot enter the United States under the visa waiver program?
You know, as a police chief of two of the largest cities in the country, I was never held accountable for having Seattle not having any crime. We did the very best we could. I would tell you that it might be very much similar to what we do now. Every day, Customs and Border Protection personnel deny admissibility in this country to 241 people that are either stopped at pre-clearance, they're stopped at a port of entry, or they're arrested or apprehended. It happens every single day.
But we're giving exceptions to a visa waiver program that, as you just had mentioned, as you just declared, has no real security. We don't know if we're preventing people from radicalized countries from coming into the United States under the visa waiver program.
And I didn't say that. I wouldn't say that it has no, I'd say it has greater security than many of the systems in place.
My time's up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to take my time to discuss what I hope is an unintended consequence of some hasty changes to this legislation before it passed. As a result of this legislation, citizens of visa waiver program countries can no longer travel to the U.S. visa-free if they are dual nationals of Iran, Iraq, Sudan, or Syria, solely due to their ancestry. And let that sink in. I mean, this feels like discrimination to me, because if the countries, the citizens of those countries we're excluding, if those countries in the visa waiver program decide to reciprocate, there's a category of millions of Americans, freedom-loving Americans, that could be exposed to discrimination as a result merely of who their parents were. And by this I mean, you could be swept into this program of discrimination even if you've never been to one of these 4 countries, if you are solely the progeny of somebody from one of these countries, because 3 of the countries consider you to be a citizen of that country, even if you weren't born there, so long as your father was a citizen of that country. This is a great concern to me. There's a piece of legislation that I have introduced. The primary sponsor is Justin Amash. It's H.R. 4380. It's called the Equal Protection in Travel Act of 2016 that would remedy this problem. And, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 letters in support of H.R. 4380, the Equal Protection in Travel Act of 2016. The first letter is from the American Civil Liberties Union, and the second letter is signed by 65 separate groups representing a wide range of viewpoints and membership.
Without objection.
So while we've got the witnesses here who are obviously experts on the visa waiver program, I want to ask, for instance, Mr. Heifetz, and anybody's welcome to answer this, of what national security advantage would there be to excluding people from this program merely because their parents were citizens of one of these countries, Mr. Heifetz?
None that are apparent.
Please elaborate.
I think a couple things are worth noting. First, the most significant expansion of the visa waiver program occurred in the Bush administration. This was a security program properly viewed as one. Secretary Chertoff has spoken on numerous occasions about the visa waiver program enhancing U.S. security, and the reason for that is the trade-off is one between what is typically a short interview by a consular officer. In exchange, rather than having that, we get heightened security standards by our visa waiver program partners, particularly including lots of data, to some of the questions that have come up, lots of data about who it is who intends to travel here, data that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. So I think part of the points, the point that has been made several times is that when we begin, if we chip away at the advantages to the member states, to the VWP member states, we risk the security that comes with the additional information about who those people are and the heightened security standards that our VWP members provide.
Well, let me elaborate about this category of individuals that's going to be discriminated against, and then ask another question. So this category includes people who may have fled here from those countries, for instance, in the 70s from Iran, who were seeking relief from that regime and have never gone back, never returned to that country. Do we have any evidence? Is there a single example of somebody who came to this country and is a dual citizen of one of these countries that presented a terroristic threat that, with credible evidence? And I'm talking about people who are either born in the United States and became, by virtue of their parentage, a citizen of one of these countries, or fled here and never went back. Is there a single example?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mansour al-Babziar, involved in a plot to try and murder the Saudi ambassador to the United States in October 2011. Iranian-American national living in Texas, instructed and abetted by a cousin from Iran involved in the Iran's Revolutionary Guards Quds forces. So that's one example. The second example, sir, is the 7 recent pardons by the president.
That individual had never traveled to Iran.
Sir, you're raising the point about dual nationals who are
Right, and-
citizens of the United States and citizens of Iran. The point I made...
My point, the question was for people who have not returned to the country or people that were born here.
I am not familiar with the travel patterns of Mr. Arbabziar, but
Okay,
certainly
well, my
he
time
was
has
a
expired.
dual national.
My time has expired, so here's the point I'm making. I think it's fair to discriminate against somebody based on their activity, their actions, or their travel patterns, but not on their parentage. And I think the legislation runs the risk of disenfranchising millions of freedom-loving Americans, and I hope people will consider H.R. 4380 to remedy this, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the panel. I've just got a couple of cleanup questions for a couple of different folks as we come to the end of this first round. Mr. Heifetz, we'll start with you. You've been asked a couple times by a couple different people, how is it, in fact, several folks have been asked, how can it be possible that somebody going someplace on business could be a national security interest or national security threat? But I don't think that's your point. Let me see if I'm correctly articulating your point, and I think Ms. Johnson may have made a similar point, which is that if we interfere with the free travel of, say, a European businessman or woman who has gone to Iran, then gone back, and then comes into this country, we deny that person the visa waiver program, then that may discourage trade or travel to and from Iran, which would be a violation of the agreement we just signed with Iran a couple weeks ago. Is that your argument, sir?
That is an argument as to why discretion with respect to the waiver is important.
I'll take that as a yes, as lawyers tend to do, but I'll take that as a yes, unless you're telling me it's no. That what you're saying is that because that interpretation of the statute would potentially or likely violate the agreement with Iran, then it's in the national security interest of the United States to do something else because breaching the agreement with Iran is against the national security interest of the United States.
Yes.
Okay. Let me ask you this. What if the law, by the way, passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the President, required the President to do something in violation of the JCPOA? Would it still qualify as a national security exception, a waiver under this law? Could the President break the law in order to not break the JCPOA?
I have a hard time envisioning this scenario that perhaps you're envisioning.
We pass a bill today that says that it is illegal for anybody who's traveled to Iran to come into the United States for a year. We passed that law today. Can the President waive that law under subsection C in the name of the national security interest of the United States?
If there's a waiver authority for national security and the administration determines that it's in the national security interest to waive it, then it's not a violation of the law.
No, but it's a violation of the separate law that we may have passed. Again, take my example. We pass a bill today. We go in the House, the Senate, the President signs it. It says, if you go to Iran, you can't come here for a year. Could the President waive that law under subsection C? In your mind?
If the administration determines that it's in the national security interest of the United States, then yes.
And I think that's right. I think that's consistent with your position. But my point is, I start to get the hair on the back of my neck stands up when we say it's okay for the President to break the law in order to accomplish something. So, but anyway, that's, again, I think we're just clarifying a couple questions that were asked before. A question about process. If I am that Iranian businessman and I go to Iran and then I come back, excuse me, I'm a British business person. I go to Iran and I come back and then I want to come to the United States. How do we know that I've been to Iran?
This is probably a better question for some of the others, but my understanding is that the fields are expanding, that the ESTA fields are expanding to ask that, to get at that issue.
That's one possible answer. It's not the best answer. The best answer would be that the computer systems would know that we're sharing information with the British. Because if I lie on the ETSA, or however you pronounce it, then am I going to get caught? Do we share information with the British on that?
We do.
Okay.
And it's in the travel records, and it's in either the name information or the advanced data. But then, of course, there's another way, and that is if you then enter the United States, or you happen to be trying to enter the United States through Dublin or Abu Dhabi, you would show to a United States Customs and Border Protection officer a passport who would go through the pages of that passport and see the stamp or see the information that you had been to one of those 4 countries. And that's what we did during the Ebola issue of those impacted countries.
Okay, and then I'm stopped at the border if that's the case.
You're denied entry because you had that travel after 2011.
Thank you. Now, to another point, and I'm going to ask Ms. Vaughn a question that I promised, Mr. Chairman, I'll wrap up. Because we talked about this hypothetical business person. We've talked, I think Mr. Heifetz in his testimony mentions a couple different folks. Mr. Heifetz, I'll read from yours. It says, "It is common and will become ever more common for a European business person to travel to Iran to conduct legitimate business." I think we all agree with that. "But if that European business person's travel will preclude further travel to the United States under the VWP, that might deter European business dealings with Iran." Then you then go on to talk about the Australian doctor who might also be deterred from going to the Middle East in order to provide services. Ms. Vaughn, someone told me before you used to work in the Foreign Service.
That's right.
I'll ask you first, and I'll ask anybody. Does anybody really believe that the possibility of getting kicked out of the visa waiver program is going to deter a doctor from going to work in the Middle East?
I do not think so, and certainly not with respect to business.
You ever have a
people
doctor
here.
ask that? Can I, if I go to this country,
Right,
can I
like,
still
oh, I
get
can't-
in? Yeah.
Yeah, I can't go to Disneyland or
Right.
something. I don't think that would deter them. I don't think it would deter a business person if they're pursuing a lucrative business opportunity in Iran or Iraq. $160 and the time of a visa interview is not going to be too much of a cost of business to go take care of that. I think it's a mistake to think of these people as victims.
I'm not going to get in victimization, but I tend to agree it doesn't discourage them. If anybody else disagree, I'm going to let Mr. Heifetz disagree with that because it was his testimony. Does anybody else disagree? Does anybody really think that's a deterrent to travel? Okay, let the record reflect nobody said no. Mr. Heifetz, it's your testimony. Why do you think it's a deterrent to travel? Do you have any personal experience with that?
Yes, we have clients who, it is to address another point that arose, I think it is common knowledge that travel history, an individual traveler's travel history is a factor that's taken into account as to whether to grant an ESTA and whether to grant entry to the United States, and properly so. We have been asked with some frequency whether travel to a particular location will cause difficulties entering the United States, and the answer to that is it might. And there have been instances in which people have foregone travel because of that concern. So I would expect that there would be instances in which people decline the type of travel that we've been discussing if VWP privileges were at risk.
Thank you, Mr. Heifetz. Thank you to the whole
Gentlemen's
panel.
time's expired.
Thank you, Chairman.
We're going to wrap up. We have votes. I'm just going to recognize the chairman of the Government Operations Subcommittee, Mr. Meadows, for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kowski, on the report that's been done for the visa overstays, and we're not talking about visa waiver, we're talking about all visa overstays. Are we expecting another report? Because as you and I agree that it's not completed, so are we expecting a final report from DHS?
We're expecting a subsequent report in which we would have greater detail and more information. Whether or not that is for this coming year, because the visa waiver.
Because we've had other testimony that would suggest that we would get that within 6 months. I guess what I'm saying is the report we got is not viewed by DHS as agreeing to the sworn testimony we've already had before this committee. Is that correct?
You know, I don't know, but I'd be happy to get back to you with an answer on that.
In the 13 seconds I have remaining, let me tell you my concern. We continue to get stonewalled with regards to the visa overstay numbers. I know that there was a report done in 2013 that has failed to be released. It is time you get it back to this committee, and we're going to continue to bring you back until we get a report. Okay? I'll yield back.
Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank the
Mr. Chairman?
witness. Yes.
Would you just yield me the same amount of time?
1 minute.
Thank you very much. Just a statement for the record. It seemed to be suggested in Mr. Mulvaney's questioning that the President of the United States had violated the law. There is no evidence of the President of the United States violating the law. That's a very grave charge. It's one any one of us at this dais would take exception to if somebody threw that at us. And it's no less significant when you do it with the President of the United States. He is taking advantage of a provision provided in the law. If we don't like it, we can change the law. And it's no different than a waiver authority that's been provided in myriad pieces of legislation to myriad presidents of the United States. I'm old enough to remember Ronald Reagan using waiver authorities with impunity. And he wasn't violating the law, even though I didn't always like it. Thank you.
Well, I think Mulvaney was talking about a hypothetical case, but I think we do on this side of the aisle, at least I do, consider that national security waiver to be narrow. And in this instance, when you're expanding it to Iranian business travel, I think a lot of us think that that's not consistent with Congress's intent. But I'd like to thank our witnesses for taking the time to appear before us today. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee will stand adjourned.